What does it take to destroy the most feared man in England? Not war, not scandal, not financial ruin. Something quieter, something closer. And the only witness to all of it, the only person who understood exactly what was being done to him and why, was a woman nobody in that house had ever bothered to learn the name of. London, October 1847. The three lords arrived at Ashford House at precisely 2 o'clock, as the invitation had specified. Lord Pembroke, Lord Ashby, Lord Danvers. Men of consequence, men whose families had held their titles long enough that the weight of them had become unremarkable. They did not arrive late to appointments. They did not leave appointments early. And they most certainly did not leave a meeting with Edmund Cavendish, the Duke of Ashford, without conducting the business that had brought them there. They left in 4 minutes. The butler showed them into the east study. The fire had been laid. The decanters stood ready on the sideboard. The chairs were positioned at the correct angles around the central table. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except the man who had summoned them was not there. Lord Pembroke settled into a chair and said nothing. Lord Ashby checked his watch and then checked it again. Lord Danvers moved to the window and looked out at the gray October street below with the careful expression of a man who has begun to suspect something he would rather not confirm. 20 minutes passed. Then the door opened, and it was Mr. Fenwick, the Duke's steward, entering with his face arranged into a blankness the lords were too experienced to misread. His Grace had been delayed, Fenwick said. He used the word twice. The second time, it landed differently. Not one of the three lords asked what kind of delay. Not one of them offered to wait. Lord Pembroke rose. Lord Ashby pocketed his watch without looking down. Lord Danvers turned from the window. They gathered their coats and their hats in the particular coordinated silence of men who have made a collective decision without speaking it aloud, and the butler opened the front door, and the October wind came in cold and sharp. The door closed. The decanters sat untouched. The fire burned on for no one. In 20 years of managing the Ashford social calendar, not one appointment had ever ended this way. Edmund Cavendish did not cancel. He did not postpone. He did not send a steward to manage men of Lord Pembroke's standing with a word like delayed delivered twice because the first time had not been convincing. The Duke of Ashford arrived. He conducted his business. He concluded it on his terms. That was the compact London had operated under for over a decade, and the compact had never, until this afternoon, been broken. In the east wing, behind the door Fenwick had been so careful not to open, Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, sat in the wing-back chair he had not been able to rise from for the better part of an hour. His right hand gripped the armrest with a pressure that had long since turned his knuckles pale. His jaw was set. His gray eyes, the ones that had made men twice his age reconsider their positions mid-sentence, were fixed on the far wall with a ferocity that had nothing left to sustain it, except will. The room was not empty. She stood near the window, her back half turned, a small tray of preparations on the table beside her that no one had officially sanctioned and no one had thought to question. She had deep brown skin and dark eyes that recorded everything and returned nothing. A small scar sat at the left corner of her mouth, faint, years old, the kind left by a childhood fall and not by anything worse. She had been in this wing for 3 days. In that time she had spoken perhaps 30 words, moved without announcement, and remained present in the particular way of someone who has learned that presence, offered quietly, can be the only useful thing. She watched the tremor in his left hand that he was working to conceal. She watched him decide to call for Fenwick, twice, and both times change his mind. She watched the moment he understood the lords had gone, and the quality of stillness that settled over him afterward, which was not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of a man holding himself together by method. She did not move toward him. She did not speak. She remained. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome. you have found something worth staying for. Like this video, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you are watching from tonight. His eyes moved to her once. A look under 2 seconds that communicated nothing readable, and then returned to the wall. 3 floors below, in the small parlor he had occupied for 6 weeks without anyone suggesting he ought to leave, Lord Gerald Cavendish received Fenwick's quiet report with his hands folded in his lap and his expression at ease. "The lords have gone?" he said. "Yes, my lord." "And his grace is resting?" Fenwick said yes. He left quickly. Gerald reached for his glass. Outside, the wind pressed at the windows. A coal cracked and shifted in the grate. He sipped his port with the unhurried pleasure of a man whose afternoon had unfolded precisely as arranged. That evening, Dr. Farrow arrived through the side entrance, as he always did, and made his way to the small parlor by the servants' stair, as he always did. He set his leather bag on the table. He did not sit. He reported the rate of decline was consistent. 6 weeks, possibly 8 if nothing changed. Gerald looked up. "And if we accelerate the rate?" Farrow was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. A log settled. "Full," he said finally. Gerald nodded. He produced an envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the table without ceremony.
Farrow took it without looking at it and left the way he had come. In the east wing, the candles had burned lower. Della Monroe stood at the window with her tray untouched, watching the courtyard below. Behind her, the Duke's breathing had finally steadied, not because the episode had fully passed, but because something in the room had shifted in that quiet way that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the fact that she was still there. He had not asked her to stay. She had not required him to. His eyes found her one more time before she gathered her tray and moved silently toward the door. And this time, the look lasted long enough for her to feel it between her shoulder blades as she stepped into the corridor. She did not turn around. July 1847, 3 months earlier. Della Monroe arrived at Ashford House on a wet Tuesday morning through the servants' entrance at the rear, carrying a canvas bag and a letter from Mrs. Holt that she had been told to present to no one except Mrs. Holt herself. She had been in London for 6 days. Before that, she had been in Essex, where the position she had held for 2 years had ended in the manner she was spending considerable effort not to revisit. She did not revisit it now. She came through the servants' hall, introduced herself to the under-housekeeper with her name and nothing further, and was shown to the small room off the back stairs that Mrs. Holt had arranged. It was not a generous room. It was clean. Della set her bag down and assessed it in the time it took to breathe once, and then she went to find Mrs. Holt. The housekeeper was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who moved through Ashford House as though she had built it herself. She looked at Della in the doorway and gave a single nod, the economy of someone who forms assessments quickly and trusts them. "You come recommended by Mrs. Graves in Hertfordshire," Mrs. Holt said. "She tells me you have knowledge."
"I have knowledge,"
Della said.
"His Grace's physician is Dr. Farrow. Dr. Farrow manages His Grace's formal care. You are not Dr. Farrow. You hold no formal medical standing, and you will not present yourself as such to any member of this household. What you do quietly."
"I understand."
"You will have access to the east wing during daylight hours. After 8 in the evening, you remain below stairs unless I send for you." Mrs. Holt paused. "His Grace does not know you are here. I have not found the right moment to tell him." Della nodded. She had worked in enough great houses to understand that this meant Mrs. Holt had decided not to tell him at all, unless circumstances forced it. She settled in. She learned the household the way she learned everything, by watching rather than asking. Ashford's rhythms were not complicated once you understood them. Edmund Cavendish ran his household with the same precision he apparently brought to everything else, and the staff had absorbed that precision so thoroughly it had become their own. Meals at the correct hour, correspondence managed before 9, Appointments entered in the book and observed without exception. She noticed Lord Gerald Cavendish on her 4th day, not because he drew attention, he was careful not to. He was charming in the way that certain people are charming, which is to say the warmth was always present, and the calculation beneath it was always just far enough below the surface to be dismissed if you preferred not to see it. He joked easily with the footman. He remembered the kitchen maid's name. He moved through the house as though he belonged there more completely than its actual owner, and the staff received this without question because it was presented to them without uncertainty. She did not form an opinion. She observed. On the evening of her 9th day,
She was returning from the still room with a preparation she had been asked to make for one of the upstairs maids when she turned the corner of the second-floor corridor and stopped. Gerald was at the far end, near the door to the Duke's private study. He was speaking in a low voice to Dr. Farrow, who stood with his back to the wall and his bag held before him like a man who has been asked to account for something. The conversation stopped the instant they registered her. The silence that followed had a particular quality. Not the silence of people interrupted in ordinary talk, but the silence of people whose ordinary talk would not survive being heard. Gerald recovered first. The warm smile arrived like a drawn curtain. "You have lost your way?" he said pleasantly. "No, my lord," Della said. "I have not." She held his gaze a moment, then moved past them both and continued down the corridor at her usual pace. She felt Gerald's eyes follow her the full length of the hallway. She told Mrs. Holt nothing. She had no proof of anything. She had seen 2 men in a corridor. What she had was the kind of instinct she had learned, across years of working in houses where things were not what they appeared, to treat with the seriousness of established fact. She began noting Dr. Farrow's visit times and durations in the small bound notebook she kept in the lining of her bag. She said nothing to anyone. 3 days later, Gerald had a private meeting with Edmund in the morning. What passed between them, Della did not hear. What she heard was the summons, delivered through Fenwick, that brought her to the Duke's study at 11 o'clock. Edmund Cavendish was standing when she entered, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair slightly longer than fashion recommended, and a face that had absorbed a great deal without softening. He looked at her with gray eyes that moved across her face with the speed of a man accustomed to making decisions about people in under a minute. "You were brought into this house without my knowledge," he said. Not an accusation, a fact, delivered in a voice that expected facts to be received without complication. "Yes, Your Grace." "You will gather your things." She looked at him. He looked back. The fire in the grate filled the silence between them with its small, indifferent crackling. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. She curtsied. She left. She descended the stairs, aware of Fenwick near the upper landing, aware of 2 housemaids in the corridor below. All of them present, all of them having heard, in the way that servants hear everything that happens in their vicinity without being seen to listen. She was also aware, without looking, of Lord Gerald Cavendish standing in the doorway of the sitting room off the main landing, watching her descend with an expression that contained neither guilt nor triumph. Only satisfaction of the very particular kind that belongs to men who have removed something they were concerned about. Outside the gates, the July morning was gray and close. She stood on the pavement with her canvas bag and the letter from Mrs. Holt that would help her with no one now, and she looked up at the face of Ashford House. She thought about the corridor on the 2nd floor, about Farrow's bag held in front of him, about the specific quality of a silence that has something inside it that cannot be let out. She made a decision. It took less than a minute. Then she turned and walked away down the street, unhurried, steady, and the decision she had made did not waver once. October 1847. Mrs. Holt sent the letter on a Friday.
Della received it on a Saturday morning in the lodging house near Clerkenwell, where she had been living for 2 months on half-day wages from an apothecary's shop whose owner asked no questions about references and paid accordingly. The letter was 4 sentences. The 4th sentence was, "I do not know who else to ask."
She arrived at Ashford House the following Tuesday through the kitchen entrance, as before. Mrs. Holt met her in the passage outside the scullery and spoke below the register of the nearest kitchen maid. His Grace had been declining for 3 months. Consistent, not dramatic, not acute, but relentless and without clear cause. Dr. Farrow attributed it to a weakness of constitution and prescribed rest and an evening tonic. Edmund refused to rest in any way that mattered and took the tonic without complaint, because he was, as Mrs. Holt put it with the economy of a woman who chose her words, not a man who made trouble about medicine. Della listened to all of this without speaking. "Lord Gerald has been in residence since August," Mrs. Holt said. "He has been very present." "Is he in the house now?" "He is, through the evening." A pause. "He will see you." "Yes," Della said. "He will." She was given no official position, no formal wage arrangement, no introduction to the upper staff beyond a brief mention that she was assisting with household medical preparations. 3 members of the staff acknowledged this. The rest absorbed it with the comfortable incuriosity of people who have learned that questions about things they haven't been told are rarely welcome in houses like this. Now, it is worth understanding what this meant for a woman in Della's position in England in 1847. The servant hierarchy in a great household was its own precise society, with its own ranks, its own courtesies, and very specific rules about who could raise a concern to whom and under what circumstances. A woman brought in informally, without a wage record or a formal letter of appointment, existed in a kind of legal shadow. She could not bring a complaint to any authority of the house. She had no standing before a magistrate. No court would receive her testimony without a man to present it. She was, for all formal purposes, invisible, which meant that anything she saw, anything she suspected, anything she knew, existed only in her own capacity to act on it, alone, without protection, without recourse. She settled back into the rhythms of the house, which had shifted, she noticed, since July. The morning precision was still there, but underneath it something had slackened. The small slackenings that happen in houses where the person at the center has lost the strength to hold everything taut. She saw Edmund for the first time on her second morning. Not formally, she was not introduced to him and did not expect to be. She saw him from the far end of the upstairs corridor as Fenwick accompanied him from his chambers to the study. And what she observed in that 30-foot walk told her more than Mrs. Holt's 4 sentences had. He moved carefully. Not with the deliberate care of a man who has always been precise in his movements. She had watched enough men of his bearing to know the difference. But with the particular carefulness of a man managing a body that has become unreliable. His left hand touched the wall once, briefly, a steadying gesture so practiced it had become unconscious. He did not know he was doing it. She watched him reach the study door and go in. She watched Fenwick close the door behind him with the expression of a man maintaining composure by concentrated effort. She had her confirmation. She went to work. On her second day, she was crossing the main corridor when she heard footsteps behind her and knew, before she turned, whose they were. Gerald moved with the ease of a man who has never had occasion to question whether a room belongs to him. He stopped at a correct distance. He smiled, warm, practiced, the smile that the kitchen maid trusted completely. "I had heard you'd returned," he said. "I confess I was surprised." "Were you, my lord?" "Given the circumstances of your last departure." He tilted his head. "A woman in your position ought to be careful about where she places herself." Accusations of theft follow a person. One instance may be explained. Two becomes a pattern that no reference can outrun. He paused. I would be very sorry to see that happen to you. She looked at him without any change in her expression. I appreciate your concern, my lord. He held her gaze for a moment, then continued down the corridor with the ease of a man who has delivered a message he is certain has been understood. She watched him go. That evening, after the house had settled and the upper floors were quiet, she went to the preparation table in the East Wing anteroom where Edmund's evening tonic was set out each night under Pharaoh's standing instruction. The decanter of base liquid, the small brown bottle, the measured glass. She picked up the small brown bottle, uncorked it, brought it to her nose. She held it there for a long moment, not in the way a person smells something out of idle curiosity, but in the concentrated, methodical way of someone reading a compound by its separate elements. Her eyes were open and fixed on the middle distance. Her attention was absolute. She set the bottle down. She recorked it precisely. She replaced it in the exact position it had occupied. Her hands were very still. She stood at that table for another full minute, looking at nothing, while the fire burned low in the grate and the house settled into its nighttime quiet around her. Then she took her things and went below stairs. She did not sleep easily, but when sleep finally came, her mind was already doing what it did when a problem had been identified, and the only remaining question was how, with the tools available to her, to solve it. The first thing Della did was nothing visible. She did not confront. She did not accuse. She did not alter the preparation in any way that could be observed, measured, or traced from the outside. She began adding, quietly, in the small window each morning before the formal preparations were set out. The compounds, she knew. Valerian, in amounts that would register only as a slightly more restful night. A preparation she had learned from a woman in Essex who had studied alongside a physician's wife, built to support the liver's work of clearing what it had been made to carry. Activated charcoal in concentrations small enough to be present in anything a careful kitchen served without remark. She documented everything in the small bound notebook she kept in the lining of her canvas bag. Dates, times, observations. The precise wording mattered to her. She wrote in the dense shorthand she had developed over years, using the terms she had been taught by women who held no formal credentials, held no formal recognition, and understood the body's responses to compounds with a depth that most men with degrees had never been required to develop. Edmund stabilized, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but she was watching closely. She was always watching closely. And the slight steadying in his movements by the end of the first week was there for eyes that knew where to look. The grip on the armrest on 2 of the mornings she observed him was less desperate than it had been. The particular gray thinness his color had been carrying shifted, by small degrees, toward something more alive. Gerald noticed nothing. He visited Edmund each morning with the solicitous warmth he performed flawlessly, sitting at the bedside, attending to the comfort of his expression, relaying household business in tones of careful, fraternal concern. When Della was in the room during these visits, she remained in her corner and listened to every word while appearing to occupy herself with the preparation tray. She was very good at appearing to do something else entirely while she listened. Mid-month, Gerald found her in the anteroom early one morning and stood in the doorway with the particular courtesy of a man who considers himself gracious for bothering to be polite to someone beneath him. I want to ask you something directly, he said, as a consideration to you. She set down what she was doing and turned to give him her attention. You are here on an informal arrangement, with no formal position, no wage record, and no standing in this household. I imagine you understand what that means practically. He paused. It means that if someone with actual standing were to raise a concern about your conduct, a second concern, following the first that ended your last posting here, there would be very little available to you by way of remedy. Do you take my meaning? Yes, my lord, she said. I take your meaning completely. He nodded with the warmth of a man who has successfully communicated an important thing, and left. She turned back to her preparations, and continued as though the conversation had not taken place. What mattered was that he believed it had worked. He needed to continue believing she was contained. He needed to continue believing she was doing nothing beyond what she appeared to be doing. Now, it is important to understand something about the world Della moved through in October of 1847. Under English law, a woman who was not a property owner, and even many who were, had almost no independent legal standing. This doctrine, known as coverture, held that a woman's legal existence was subsumed by her husband's upon marriage, or, for unmarried women, remained so constrained by social and economic dependence that its practical effect was nearly identical. She could not enter a contract in her own name. She could not bring a civil action before most courts. She could not make an accusation against a man of Gerald's rank without a male advocate willing to stand behind the claim, and no male advocate with anything to lose would stand behind the claim of an informally employed woman with no references against the brother of a duke. Gerald understood this with complete precision. It was not incidental to his plan. It was structural to it. He had been counting on it since July. She was doing considerably more than she appeared to be doing. By the third week of October, Edmund's returning clarity began to surface in small but definite ways. Questions directed at Fenwick with more of the old precision behind them. A letter attended to at the desk that had sat untouched for the previous 10 days. Then a morning when she entered the east wing and found him standing at the window rather than seated, watching the courtyard below with eyes that had regained something she had not seen in them since her first day back. He heard her enter. He did not turn immediately. "The morning preparation," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He turned then and looked at her. And this time the look was different from every look that had come before it. The assessment was still there, but beneath it, something was paying a different quality of attention. Something that had begun, quietly, to ask a question. She crossed the room and began her work at the tray with the same efficiency she always brought to it. She felt his eyes follow her movements in a way they had not followed them before. Neither of them spoke. But when she paused at the door to give her customary brief acknowledgement before leaving, she found he was still watching her, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has begun to understand that what is happening around him is not what he has been told it is. The night it happened was a Thursday. 3 days prior, Gerald had met with Dr. Farrow and noted that Edmund's decline had ceased its expected progression. Farrow had no explanation. Gerald provided the instruction: increase the dose. Farrow had objected. A higher concentration would alter the observable presentation, he said. It would become harder to sustain the appearance of natural wasting illness. Gerald had listened to this with patience and then said, in the even tone he used when a conversation had reached its conclusion, that he trusted Farrow to manage the presentation as he always had. The envelope had changed hands. Farrow had done as instructed. Della did not know this. What she knew, at 10:30 that evening, was that something was wrong. She had been in the lower corridor when the quality of the sounds reaching her from the upper floor shifted in a way that had no single definable element but was, to someone who had been listening carefully for weeks, unmistakable. A silence where there should have been the small movements of a man still awake and working. She took the back stairs without a candle. She had learned the house in the dark a month ago. As a precaution she had not been able to explain to herself precisely, but had acted on without hesitation. The study door was not fully latched. She pushed it open. Edmund was at his desk, but not in the posture of a man at work. He had sat down because the alternative was no longer available to him, and he was now engaged in the considerable effort of remaining upright in the chair. His left hand was pressed flat against the desktop. His right covered his temple. The single candle threw his face into hard relief, the gray eyes wide and fixed on the flame with the concentration of a man using it as the only available anchor. He heard her enter. He did not speak. The controlled expression he had worn for 30 years was visible as a construction now, actively, physically visible in the set of his jaw
and the way his shoulders had drawn slightly in,
bracing against something that had no surface to push back against. She crossed the room to the preparation table by the window and worked quickly. Behind her, the only sounds were the fire settling in the grate and the Duke's breathing, shallow, deliberate, and very carefully maintained. She brought the preparation to the desk and set it before him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Drink it," she said. Her voice was quiet. It was not a request. He drank it. She pulled the second chair to the side of the desk, close enough to be of use, far enough to preserve the small remaining distance his pride required. And she sat, and she waited. The fire burned. The candle guttered once and held. Outside, the October wind moved through the street in long, low gusts that pressed at the window glass and found no way in. The preparation began its work in perhaps 20 minutes. The shaking in his hands eased. The effortful quality of his breathing released. He did not speak, and she did not require him to. I need to pause here. When I first wrote this scene, I had to step away from my desk for a moment. What she chose to do, for a man who had dismissed her without explanation on the word of the person who was poisoning him, the cost of that choice and the dignity of it genuinely stopped me. Stay with me. This is where the story truly begins. It was close to midnight when it happened. She could not have said what changed, what specific sound or shift of light announced it. But there was a moment when the careful, load-bearing tension that Edmund Cavendish had carried in his body for the full duration of his decline simply gave way. Not loudly, not with any of the outward drama that the word suggests. He pressed his hand over his face, and something in the line of his shoulders altered. And for a man who had controlled Parliament committees and run 3 counties, and had made lords step back from his gaze across a room, the effect was devastating in its smallness. She did not look away. She did not speak. She did not reach for him. She understood, in the way she understood most things about him by now, that what he needed from her in this moment was not comfort he hadn't asked for, but the simple, unbroken witness of someone who would not turn away from what she saw. So she did not turn away. It lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Then, slowly, the line of his shoulders changed. He lowered his hand. He looked at the candle first, which is what a man looks at when he is returning to himself and is not yet ready to be seen in the face. Then he looked at her. The grey eyes held something she had no word for. It was not gratitude. It was older than gratitude. It was the expression of someone who has been seen doing the one thing they could not have allowed anyone to witness, and has discovered, to their confusion, that the seeing has not ended them. "You know what it is," he said. His voice was controlled, but beneath the control, just beneath, was the voice of a man asking a question he is not certain he once answered. She looked at him steadily. "I know what it is," she said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of something that has been waiting a long time to become what it now was, an acknowledged truth between 2 people in a room that had held the weight of the unspoken for months. Outside, the earliest suggestion of grey light had begun to press against the window glass. The candle on the desk had burned nearly to its base. The fire in the grate had reduced itself to a low, steady orange that gave the room its only warmth. Edmund looked at the window. He looked at his hands, which had stopped their shaking and now lay still on the desk in front of him. He looked at the preparation cup she had brought him, empty now on its small tray. "How long have you known?" he said.
With certainty, 3 weeks. She paused. With sufficient suspicion to act on. Since the night I came back.
He absorbed this. The gray eyes were still and clear. Not the glassy clarity of illness, but the genuine clarity of a man who is, for the first time in months, thinking without interference. The difference was visible, and she could see that he knew it was visible, and that knowing it was a thing he was still adjusting to. "Then I owe you an accounting," he said, "for July."
"That," she said, "can wait until you have slept."
She stood, gathered the preparation tray, and moved to the door. At the threshold she stopped, as she always stopped, for the brief acknowledgement that was the only courtesy her unofficial position afforded her. He was still watching her. "Della Monroe," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. The accusation came on a Wednesday morning. Della understood it was coming before anyone told her. She heard the particular urgency in the footsteps outside her room at 7:30 and knew, from their number and their direction, that something had been set into motion. She dressed without hurrying. She was calm in the way she was always calm when she understood that what was approaching had been arranged in advance by someone who believed it would work. The pearl brooch, a piece that had belonged to the late Duchess, kept in the upstairs jewelry cabinet for 15 years and visited by no one, was found by a footman in the folded linen on Della's side table. The footman reported to Fenwick. Fenwick reported to Gerald. Gerald summoned the household. They assembled in the main hall. It was a large room, high ceilings, 2 fireplaces lit against the October chill, the kind of proportioned grandeur that made everything that happened within it feel witnessed and permanent. Which was, Della understood perfectly well, the point. Gerald did not choose this room by accident. He chose it because it was the room in which things done here could not be undone quietly. He stood to one side and spoke with genuine regret. He was exceptionally good at genuine regret. He laid the situation out clearly. The brooch, the discovery, the location, the piece's history and value. And he built toward his conclusion with the patience of a man who wants the audience to arrive at the word before he says it. Theft. He let the room feel the shape of it before he gave it its name. Several of the upper staff had the expression of people being asked to witness something they found uncomfortable but could not find grounds to object to. The senior footman, a careful man of 40 who had been in the Ashford household for 12 years, kept his eyes on a point just above Gerald's left shoulder and did not allow them to move. The under-housekeeper, who had managed the jewelry cabinet herself for the past 8 years, stood very still, the expression on her face the expression of someone doing arithmetic. Going back through weeks of access and opportunity, through every morning the cabinet had been opened and every evening it had been locked, and arriving at answers that did not fit the account being given to her. She did not speak. No one who worked in this house spoke when a lord was speaking. That was the machinery Gerald had always relied upon, the deference that rank demanded from people whose livelihoods depended on providing it. Mrs. Holt stood at the back of the room. Her face was arranged into a blankness so absolute it had become its own form of communication. Della stood in the center of the hall. She did not lower her eyes. She did not fold her hands. She did not make any adjustment to her posture that could be read as guilt or as performance. She stood with the same quality of stillness she brought to the preparation table in the mornings, not the stillness of someone who has been made small, but the stillness of someone who knows exactly where she stands and requires no permission to stand there. She looked at Edmund. Edmund was seated near the fire. This detail was not lost on anyone present, that the Duke of Ashford, who had stood at the head of this hall for 12 years, was in a chair. Fenwick had positioned it near the grate, and Edmund held himself upright with the precision of a man refusing to let his body's limitations become visible. But the chair was there. Gerald had arranged for the chair to be there, and had arranged for this gathering to take place now, while it was still there to be noticed. Gerald's presentation concluded. He stood with the subtleties of a man who has given this room everything it needs to do what he requires of it. The only remaining question was what the Duke would say, and the shape of Gerald's confidence communicated clearly that he believed he already knew. Edmund looked at Della. Della looked back. The fire crackled. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a footman shifted his weight and immediately went still again. The silence stretched. 8 seconds, 12, 15, with the tautness of a room full of people trying not to be the first to breathe. Gerald opened his mouth. Gerald. One word. Edmund's voice, quiet, controlled, carrying no more volume than a normal sentence required, and the room went still for it in the automatic way that rooms go still for certain voices. Gerald closed his mouth. The room, which had been leaning almost imperceptibly in a single direction, stopped. It is difficult to convey to someone who has not stood in such a room what that single word accomplished. Gerald had been speaking for 4 minutes. He had marshaled his evidence, deployed his regret,
Managed the room's emotional temperature with the practiced precision of someone who has spent 30 years learning which lever to press and when. He had done everything correctly. And then Edmund had said his name. 1 syllable, no inflection, no anger, and everything Gerald had built in those 4 minutes simply ceased to hold. The room did not understand why. It did not need to. The effect was sufficient. This was the thing that had always made Edmund Cavendish what he was. Not the titles, not the wealth, not the seats in Parliament. Those were instruments. What made the room change temperature when he entered it was something older and less explicable. The absolute alignment between what he was and what he appeared to be. There was no performance to read through. When he spoke, the room heard the thing itself. Edmund did not look at his brother immediately. He looked at the fire. His left hand rested on the arm of the chair with a deliberate stillness that, to anyone paying very close attention, was not the stillness of a weakened man, but the stillness of a man who is choosing, with enormous, visible precision, exactly how much of himself to reveal. Then he looked at Gerald. The two brothers regarded each other across the assembled household, and the thing that passed between them in that moment had the weight and the density of something that had been building for a very long time and had, in this room, finally broken the surface. "Clear the room," Edmund said. "All of you." He did not look at Della when he said it. But as the staff filed out around her and she turned to leave with the rest, she heard, very quietly, her name. "Not you," Edmund said. She stopped. The room continued to empty behind her. Fenwick heard it through the door. He would not acknowledge this afterward, not to Mrs. Holt, not to the footmen who asked him with their eyes as they passed him in the lower corridor. He was a man who had served the Ashford household for 19 years and had, in that time, formed very specific principles about what constituted proper conduct. Listening at closed doors did not fall within them. He stood at the door for 11 minutes. What he heard was not shouting. He had perhaps expected shouting. The meeting of two brothers carrying this much unspoken between them seemed to require it. What he heard instead was Edmund's voice, low and deliberate, in a register he had never heard the Duke use with anyone who was not a political adversary. And at intervals, Gerald's voice, which began with its customary ease and, over the course of those 11 minutes, lost it. Inside the study, Edmund had set a letter on the desk. It was dated the 22nd of August, 6 weeks after Della's dismissal in July. It was addressed to Mr. Aldridge, Edmund's solicitor, and it contained a single instruction: investigate Lord Gerald Cavendish's recommendations regarding changes to household staff in the preceding 14 months. The report Aldridge had returned lay beside it. 2 others,
Edmund said. In 14 months. Both in positions with access to my personal quarters. Both dismissed on your recommendation. Both dismissed without reference, without cause given, without the standard courtesy extended to staff of their length of service. He paused. The pattern was yours. Gerald looked at the two documents. His face had the expression of a man recalibrating under pressure. Edmund, I filed this report, Edmund said, and I chose to watch. I did not yet know what I was waiting to understand. The gray eyes were entirely steady. I know now. Now, it is worth understanding what Edmund Cavendish could and could not do from where he stood. A formal criminal accusation in 1847 England required evidence submitted through a magistrate, witnesses willing to testify, and a legal process built to move with the deliberateness of a system designed by men of property to protect men of property. What Edmund could not do was take his brother before a court on a pattern and a private report alone. What he could do was considerably more immediate. A Duke of Ashford controlled 4 parliamentary seats. He maintained financial relationships with the men who ran half of Parliament's key committees. His signature on a letter had, on 3 separate occasions in the preceding decade, determined whether a piece of legislation survived. Formal legal proceedings were one instrument. They were not the only one, nor were they the fastest. And there was something else. Something that the lords of 1847 England understood in their bones, even when they did not speak it plainly. A Duke of Ashford's social weight was not a metaphor. It was an operational reality. The men who sat across from Edmund at committee tables, who needed his support to pass their bills and his silence to protect their arrangements, those men did not require a court's judgment before they acted on his. The legal system moved in months and years. The social machinery moved in hours. Gerald had counted on the law's slowness to protect him. He had not adequately accounted for the other thing. Gerald understood this. He was, underneath the charm and the practiced warmth, a very intelligent man. You have nothing provable, Gerald said. Not yet, Edmund said. Sit down, Gerald. Gerald did not sit. You moved to dismiss her, Edmund said, because she had begun to see something. Whatever was visible to someone paying the right kind of attention, you recognized it and moved before it could become knowledge. He held his brother's gaze. She came back anyway. Silence. She came back, Edmund said again, and this time the words carried something that was not anger. Something older and colder and more considered. And you used the same method twice. Because the first time it succeeded, and you are a man who does not abandon what has worked. The fire had burned low. Gerald stood at the far side of the desk with his hands at his sides, and the ease entirely gone, replaced by something that was not quite fear, but was working steadily toward it. The matter of the brooch is concluded, Edmund said. She is not dismissed. Whatever you caused to be entered in Fenwick's record, you will retract today. He placed a fresh sheet of paper on the desk. He set a pen beside it. Sit down, Gerald. This time, Gerald sat. He emerged from the study 34 minutes later. He walked down the corridor with the bearing of a man performing composure for an audience he knows is watching his face closely. Fenwick stepped back from the door with the unhurried ease of a man who had simply been passing through. Gerald descended to the small parlor without speaking to anyone. He sat alone for a long time with his eyes on nothing and the sound of Edmund's voice still moving in the air around him, low and deliberate, in a register he had never heard before. For the first time in 6 months, Gerald Cavendish did not know how this ended. Della brought the notebook to Edmund 3 days after the study. She had not been asked. She had decided, in the particular, complete, unannounced way she decided things, that the moment had arrived. The night in the study had opened something, and Gerald's retreat from certainty was a window that would not remain open indefinitely. She set the notebook on the desk before him and stepped back. He opened it. She watched him read. The notebook was 41 pages. Edmund read it in silence, turning each page with a care that registered to her as the careful attention of someone who understands they are holding something that cost a great deal to build. When he finished, he closed it and set both hands flat on the cover and was still for a moment. "How long?" he said, not a question.
A measurement. I identified it in the 3rd week of October. She paused. I had suspicions from July. He absorbed this. The counter-treatment, without altering the preparation in any way that could be detected. Yes. Alone, he said, without standing in this house, without any formal protection or recourse. He looked up at her. You did this alone. Yes, Your Grace. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached for the bell pull. Mr. Aldridge arrived at Ashford House before 7 that evening. He was a precise, unhurried man of 60 who had managed the Ashford legal affairs for 23 years and who, in that time, had learned that the correct response to whatever Edmund Cavendish placed before him was to attend to it immediately, thoroughly, and without requiring explanation. Edmund placed Della's notebook before him. Aldridge read it in the anteroom with a lamp and a glass of water, and emerged after 50 minutes with the expression of a man who has been sitting with a question for some time and has just been handed the answer to it. The physician, Aldridge said. Yes, Edmund said. Tonight. Tonight. Dr. Farrow arrived at Ashford House believing he had been called to review the Duke's condition. He entered the library and found Edmund behind the desk, Aldridge to his left, and the notebook open to the page Della had marked. The entry that named the compound by its constituent elements, the delivery mechanism, and the precise dates on which the preparation had been altered. He looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then he looked at Edmund. He lasted 40 minutes under questioning, not because Edmund raised his voice. Edmund did not raise his voice once. He simply asked questions with the gray eyes fixed steadily on Farrow's face and the full weight of everything his name represented present in the room, without requiring demonstration. The questions were precise. They left no gap wide enough for evasion to fit through. Where Aldridge pressed with the logic of a solicitor, dates, contradictions, documented inconsistencies, Edmund pressed with the particular quiet of a man who already knows every answer and is giving the person across from him the opportunity to offer it voluntarily before the alternative becomes necessary. This technique, Aldridge had observed across 23 years, was more effective than any raised voice had ever been. There was something in the combination, the solicitor's precision, the Duke's absolute stillness, that made the room feel smaller with every passing minute. Farrow was an intelligent man. He understood, 15 minutes in, that the question was no longer whether this came out, but only what his role in its coming out would be. He named Gerald. He named the compound. He named the supplier in Cheapside. He produced from the inside pocket of his coat, with the resignation of a man who has been waiting for this moment and has prepared for it in the only way available to him, a folded record of the envelopes. Dates. Amounts. 6 months of transactions recorded in a handwriting that was either the mark of a guilty conscience or the self-preservation of a man who understood that records, at the right moment, could shift the weight of a falling thing. Edmund looked at the record. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Aldridge. "Tonight," he said, and the word contained several instructions simultaneously. Gerald's access to the estate accounts was frozen before midnight. Aldridge sent 3 letters before he departed, one to Gerald's primary creditor, one to the man in Cheapside, and one to a magistrate with whom Edmund maintained a relationship of 20 years' standing. The letters were brief and precise, and each contained exactly as much information as its recipient needed to understand that what they had been participating in
was finished.
After Aldridge left, the house settled into quiet. The fire in the study had burned down to embers. Edmund sat at his desk, with Della's notebook open before him at the first page. She had written the first entry on the third day of her return. Compound present. Cumulative. Source not yet confirmed. Counteraction begun. 3 days after arriving back at a house that had dismissed her without cause. No position, no wage, no standing before any authority that would hear her, no protection of any kind. He sat with that for a long time, the weight of what she had done and what it had cost to do it, and what it had prevented, settling over him in the particular way of things that are true before you understand them, and heavier once you do. He thought about July, about the morning he had summoned her to the study and told her, in the voice he used for facts that did not require discussion, that she would gather her things. He had not known her name. He had not asked for her name. He had given Gerald's concern the weight of certainty, as he had given Gerald's concerns weight for 29 years. Because Gerald was charming and consistent, and never appeared to want anything badly enough to be suspected of wanting it at all. He turned to the last page of the notebook. The final entry was dated the 8th of November. 2 lines. Compound no longer detectable. Recovery proceeding as expected. The work here is done. She had written it as a conclusion, as a closing of accounts. She had not written it as a prelude to anything, as a negotiation, as a claim, as the opening line of a conversation about what he owed her. She had written it the way she did everything, completely, without display, and with no apparent expectation that anyone would notice. He closed the notebook. He sat in the quiet house with the embers cooling in the grate and the November wind pressing at the glass, and he understood, with the clarity that had been returning to him steadily over 3 weeks and was now, tonight, entirely his own again, that the most significant decision the gathering would require him to make was not about Gerald at all. London noticed Edmund Cavendish before London was told anything. This was the nature of power in 1847. It communicated through registers that had nothing to do with announcement. A man's returning vigor was visible in his posture before it was visible in anything he said. The way he moved through a room changed. The way a room reorganized itself for him changed. A lord who encountered him at his club on the 4th of November told his wife that evening that something had happened at Ashford. He could not say what, precisely, but that the Duke looked like a man who had been handed back something he had thought was permanently gone. Edmund walked with a cane for 2 weeks. He carried it as though it were an accessory rather than a necessity, and he abandoned it on the 15th of November without remark. Nobody remarked on its absence either. These things were understood. He began calling in what was owed. The 4 creditors Gerald had approached, men who had accepted his implied pledge of the Ashford inheritance against future funds, received visits from Aldridge. The visits were brief and conducted without warmth. Gerald's promises had carried no legal standing. He had no authority to pledge the estate, but the creditors were left in no uncertainty about the consequences of attempting to build on those promises further. 2 sent letters to Gerald that week withdrawing their arrangements entirely. The other 2 sent no letters at all and made no further contact with him, which communicated the same conclusion with greater clarity. The gathering was arranged for the 22nd of November. In the invitations sent on Edmund's behalf, it was framed as a resumption of business, the Duke of Ashford returning to the management of certain matters deferred during his illness. This framing was accurate. It was also the kind of framing that caused Lord Pembroke, Lord Ashby, and Lord Danvers, the 3 men who had left his study in October without offering to wait, to respond with a speed that indicated they understood a great deal was at stake. In England, in 1847, social ruin did not require legislation. A man could face criminal proceedings and imprisonment, and society might still receive his family cautiously if the money held and the right people remained available.
But a man cut by a Duke of Ashford standing, in a room full of witnesses, in a manner that left no room for later reinterpretation, did not recover. Not in the drawing rooms, not in the institutions whose functioning depended on the goodwill of the men who ran them. The machinery of social life operated by consensus, and when consensus shifted, it shifted completely. It had no mechanism for shifting back. It is worth understanding the precision of this. In 1847 London, a gentleman's reputation was not a metaphor for his character. It was a functional asset, as concrete and as negotiable as a property deed. It determined what rooms he could enter, what credit he could access, which marriages his children could make, which positions were available to his allies. A scandal was not an embarrassment. It was the removal of that asset, publicly, permanently, and in full view of everyone who had ever extended trust on the basis of it. The men who had benefited from Gerald's charm over 30 years had made investments. They had told stories about him in the rooms that mattered. When the evidence arrived, their first thought was not justice. It was the assessment of their own exposure and the speed with which they could put distance between themselves and the wrong side of what was coming.
This was the world Gerald had built his survival in. This was the world that was now moving against him. Gerald attended a dinner on the 18th of November. He arrived with the ease that had carried him through every room in London for 30 years and found, for the first time, that it did not take him where he expected. Conversations shortened. Groups did not open to admit him. A man he had known since childhood looked past him in the entrance hall with a vagueness that could not be attributed to poor eyesight. He sent a note to Edmund requesting a private meeting. No response came. He sent a second note. No response came to that either. On the evening of the 21st, Gerald dressed for the gathering with the deliberate attention of a man preparing for a performance he has always given well. He chose his best coat. He spent longer than usual at the mirror. He told himself that whatever was waiting in that room, he had faced more difficult rooms and had always, in the end, found his way back to the center of them. The Ashford House main receiving room was lit by 36 candles and fires burning in both hearths when Gerald entered. He stepped through the doors and registered immediately that the room was fuller than the invitation had suggested, and that heads had turned toward the entrance when he arrived. He smiled. He moved toward the nearest group. The nearest group took one step back. It was not dramatic. It was small and unhurried and collective. 3 people who had known Gerald Cavendish for years, stepping back together with the smooth coordination of people acting on a shared and unspoken understanding. His smile remained in place. His feet stopped moving. Across the room, Edmund stood near the far fireplace with Aldridge beside him. He had not looked up when Gerald entered. He looked up now. Edmund did not call the room to order. He did not announce anything. He simply moved away from the fireplace toward the center of the room, and the room organized itself around that movement, in the way rooms have always organized themselves around men whose presence carries that particular weight. And then he stood in the center and waited, and the conversations ended, one by one, until there was only the fire and the candles and the sound of no one speaking. He said Gerald's name. Gerald was still near the entrance. He had not moved further into the room. His coat was impeccable. His expression was what he had constructed it to be. He looked at his brother across 40 feet of candlelit carpet and kept the warmth in his face, because warmth was what had always saved him, and he was not a man who abandoned what had always worked. Aldridge opened the case. Not a speech. Aldridge was not a man for speeches. He set out the facts in the steady, unhurried manner of a solicitor who trusts the facts to accomplish what performances attempt and fail. The compound, the physician, the envelopes and their amounts, the dates spanning 6 months, the record in Pharaoh's handwriting. He read Pharaoh's written testimony aloud. He set Della's notebook on the table beside him. 41 pages, dated 3rd of October to 8th of November,
where it could be seen by everyone present. Lord Pembroke stood near the west wall with his hands behind his back and his face doing nothing visible. Lord Ashby was very still. Lord Danvers looked once at the notebook and then at Gerald, and did not look away again. Gerald tried. He spoke into a pause in Aldridge's presentation. A measured, calm statement about complexity, about fraternal misunderstanding, about the kind of misreading that could be made to look like something it was not by a woman with no formal standing and a private grievance to settle. He made the case with skill. He had always been skilled at this. The room did not move. Not a single face shifted in the direction he needed.
The warmth that had worked in every drawing room in England for 30 years found no purchase here. Tonight, in this light, in front of these people who had all received Aldridge's letter and had all, in the days since, made their own quiet inquiries. Gerald's voice, still smooth, reached the end of its sentence and fell into silence. Edmund had not spoken since calling his brother's name. He did not speak now. He watched Gerald with the gray eyes that had held Parliament steady across a decade of difficult votes, and he gave Aldridge a single nod, and Aldridge concluded. That nod was the end of Gerald Cavendish in London. Not the criminal proceedings that would follow in the months ahead. Those were necessary and would be completed, but they were formality after the fact. The end happened in that nod, in this room, in front of the people whose collective withdrawal constituted the only verdict that had ever mattered in this world. Two men stepped forward and accompanied Gerald out. It was simply clear, and Gerald walked, because a man of his breeding walks rather than be carried, and the doors closed, and the room released a breath. The lords came to Edmund one by one. Lord Pembroke first, which determined the order for the rest. Brief exchanges, formal. The mathematics of a social world recalibrating itself, which it accomplishes without apology and without acknowledging what it had been prepared to allow when the outcome appeared to point another way. Edmund received each of them with the correct courtesies and said very little. When the last exchange was complete, he moved. He did not stop at the group near the east fireplace that opened to receive him. He did not pause for the man by the window who began to speak. He crossed the room with the directness of a man who has somewhere specific to be, and the people between him and that place stepped aside. He stopped in front of the woman standing near the door to the rear corridor. She had been there since the gathering began. Close to the door, where the light was slightly thinner, in the position she had always occupied in this house, the position that no one in the room had ever thought to look at directly, because why would anyone look directly at a woman they had decided was not worth the attention? He said her name. Della Munro. He said it clearly, in the carrying voice he used when he intended to be heard. The nearest cluster, Lord Ashby, two women Edmund had known for 15 years, Aldridge at his right, stopped and turned. Without what she built, alone, with no standing and no protection, Edmund said, not to the room, but not away from it. Nothing here would remain. The room was very quiet. Della looked at him. The dark eyes, which had watched and recorded and endured in every corridor of this house, through every morning preparation and every cold warning and every night when the work was hers alone, were steady. She did not perform anything. She received what was said with the same stillness she had brought to everything, which had never been the stillness of someone suppressed, but always the stillness of someone who has never required the room's permission to be present in it. The people who had never learned her name learned it now. Later. The candles burning low, most of the guests gone, the footman moving quietly through the receiving room restoring order. Mrs. Holt had retired. Aldridge had left with the case documents and the notebook, which would spend the next several months as evidence in proceedings across multiple courtrooms.
Della was in the East Wing, gathering her preparations into the canvas bag, the bag that had come through the servants' entrance in July with no formal welcome, the bag that had returned in October through the kitchen door, the bag now full of the tools she had used to keep a man alive who had once dismissed her on a brother's quiet word. She heard footsteps.
She knew them without looking up. Edmund stood in the doorway. He looked at the bag. He looked at her. The gray eyes held none of the things they had held before. Not the assessment, not the guard, not the careful management of what he allowed to be seen. They held something considerably more exposed than any of those things. "Stay," he said. The word was quiet. It carried none of the instruments of his authority. No title, no wealth, no implication of consequence. It came simply, in the voice underneath all the other voices, the one she had heard only once before, in a study at midnight when the last of the wall had come down. She was still. He waited. He did not press the case. He did not explain or justify himself, because he had spent enough months watching her to understand that she did not respond to cases made on behalf of the man presenting them. She responded to truth, offered plainly and without conditions attached. And then she decided. The choice was hers. It had always been hers. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the canvas bag down. The fire said nothing. The house was quiet in the particular way of houses that have been holding their breath for a very long time and have finally, after everything, been allowed to let it go. If this story reached something in you tonight, share it. Someone in your life needs it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Leave a comment and tell me the moment that stayed with you. Your words bring others here, and that matters more than you know.